we have funded a series of outstanding books, mostly written by young scholars, mostly first-time authors. The books are there on the website of the New India Foundation, newindiafoundation.org. 18 books published so far, another dozen in press. Some of our authors are in the audience, and we are very proud and honored to have them with us here today and to celebrate their work, which has really opened up new dimensions in the understanding of this extraordinary and reckless political experiment called the Republic of India. So the books have covered economics, technology, society, films, culture, language. So that is in some ways our flagship activity, which is aimed, as I said, at nurturing young writers and scholars. The complementary activity, which is our annual lecture, is in some respects at the other end of the spectrum. It's an event where a distinguished scholar or activist speaks to an audience of citizens in Bangalore on some aspect of India, past, present and future. Our past lecturers have included Ela Bhatt, Andre Bete, Raghuram Rajan, Rahul Mehrotra, and most recently Arvind Subramanian last year. We are very proud and honored to have Professor Esther Duflo with us here today. 240 years ago, Tipu Sultan, who was then ruling our city and large sections of our state, sent 3 emissaries to Paris. He actually sent the first Indian embassy to Paris before, of course, the Republic of India had been conceived. And 240 years later, we are welcoming Esther Duflo here. She is a citizen of France and of the United States. She is one of the world's great minds, educated in Paris and then in America. She has been for many years a professor at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. I will not give an extensive introduction to her work and her achievements. You can Google them. But she is, as I said, one of the world's great minds. Among her prizes is a medal called the John Lewis Bates Medal, which is awarded to the most distinguished, promising and talented economist under the age of 40. The first recipient of that medal was Paul Samuelson. Later recipients have included James Tobin, Kenneth Arrow, Robert Solow, Joseph Stiglitz, and so on and so forth. Now, this is a medal which is among her greatest achievements. But when I was looking at other aspects of her CV, what impressed me as a historian as much as the fact that she got a medal that had previously been awarded to many Nobel laureates was the series of distinguished lectures she has given. She has spoken in honor of Thomas Schelling, John Newman, Richard Ely, and John Maynard Keynes. Now, these are not names that everyone in this room will know, but this is Albert Hirschman. So, to add to that list, this is a list of not just some of the world's greatest economists, but some of the very people for whom that very special category of economists who have not only been great scholars but great moralists, who are in a sense go back to a classical tradition of economics that has been increasingly lost in the 20th and 21st century as economics in the hands of many of its practitioners, not Esther Duflo, not Thomas Schelling, not Albert Hirschman, and certainly not John Maynard Keynes, but in many of its practitioners, economics has become a very technical science, a branch of mathematics, practicing what some people call physics envy, and so on and so forth. So you will see from her lecture and from the work she has done that she is a great scholar and also a profoundly original moral thinker. I just say one last thing about her personally. Esther Duflo did her first 2 degrees in history, and then took a PhD in economics. Now, it so happens that my first 2 degrees are in economics. And doing a little bit of research as to why she shifted from history to economics, I discovered that she did not find history challenging enough. Now, it so turns out that economics did not find me challenging enough. And it's a far more complicated and tortuous and admirable and heroic transition to make from history to economics than the one I made from economics to history, which is in some ways a cop-out. So I welcome Esther Duflo to the stage.
Thank you very much. It's a real honor and pleasure to be here, to be part of it, to take my place as this long long list of distinguished speakers in this series. Thank you very much, Ram, for this gracious introduction. I think it's customary maybe to start a lecture saying that I'm going to talk about the work of many people, and what I'm going to talk about today represents not only my work but that of a collection of people, but I'm still going to do it today because I think it's particularly important. I'm going to talk about, I'm going to try and give you some aspect of the work that I've been doing over almost 20 years since I've started working in India. As it happens, my first real project in India was in Bangalore, but I'm not going to talk about it. I'm going to talk about starting with my second real project in India, which took place in Bombay and Baroda. This work has taken place with Pratham, of which there are many representatives in the room, and with JPAL South Asia, although it didn't start with JPAL since JPAL didn't exist then, but has been, as you will see, these two organizations have been the core and the ferment and everything on which I'm going to talk about today. Now, I am going to ask, although that's going to embarrass them, but just to give you a sense of just how many people that involves right here, the Pratham people who are here and the JPAL people who are here to wave for a minute. So that includes you, Rukmini, although you are just wait for a minute, Pratham and JPAL, and thank you very much. As intellectual contributors, people with their names on the paper, we have here Rukmini Banerjee, CEO of Pratham, and co-author on pretty much all of the work that I'm going to talk about today, at least the one that involves me. With that said, what I want to talk about today is the question of how to fix primary education in India. I've called talk Every Child Counts, with the idea that trying to get 3 ideas across. First of all, is every child is important. Second of all, it should be our objective that every child should count. But third, and I think you want to keep that in mind, is that it is the case that every child counts. We are just extremely bad at leveraging the skills that are already there. And that is something which I came to know maybe the most recently in my work, and I'm going to talk about some today. So the problem about schooling in India is by now well known, thanks in particular to the work of the Asser Center. There are high enrollment rates, that's not a problem, but low attendance, and even worse, low learning level. So let me substantiate these various things. This is a slide that's directly taken from the Asser Center 2014. Okay, what you can see, but that's not that's a generally known fact, that most of the kids are in school. So 96.7% of children across India are in fact enrolled in school in rural India. Urban India is probably even greater. However, attendance is less high, so you can see that it varies from place to place. On any given day in India, 71% of the kids are there. There are places where it's less than 60%. These absence rates are a combination of some kids absent some of the time, but also some kids just never there. So the actual participation in school might be a bit less than the enrollment rate suggests, but still the enrollment rate is high. However, still from the ASER report, this is not ASER 2014, but that's the logo I could find. We also know from the ASER report, from going and interviewing children in their home and not in the school, and therefore getting a representative sample of children all over rural India, that most of these kids, despite being in school and willy-nilly showing up most of the time, are not learning at the level that we should expect. So this is for reading, where you can see that pretty much constantly between 2011 and 2016, the ASER report found less than half of the children being able in Standard 5 to read an easy paragraph that you should read at the end of Standard 2. The results in math are even worse. And that's something that I'm going to come back to because I've recently done a lot of work on math. You can see that in Standard 3, 25% of kids can do this subtraction. You can try and do it in your head. And in Standard 5, 26% of the kids can do this division. Even by Standard 8, only 44% of the kids can do this division. That means 56 cannot. So just pause for a minute, that's a problem. This is really a sign of a system that is not delivering. But I think it's even deeper than that. It's even worse than that. It's not just that the system is not delivering the learning that we expect from it, but the system is also missing out on skills that are present, and that it's, in a sense, instead of using those skills to leverage on them in order to build more skills, it's pretty effective at squashing those skills and the confidence that goes with it. And this is something which I was sort of always suspected, that there was a lot of talent around, and that somehow in the schools, something happened, which meant that this talent was somehow missing in action. But recently, I've been involved in 2 projects, both on mathematics, that really drove this point home very, very much for me. One of them involved preschoolers, and the other involved adolescents. And both of them are on mathematics. So let's look at the preschooler first. So I was involved in a wonderful project. Rukmini Banerjee always jokes that every time someone in Pratham has children, they get interested in early childhood education. So as soon as I had my first child reached 2 years, I became extremely interested in early childhood education. And I convinced wonderful cognitive scientist at Harvard, Liz Pelker, and Rukmini to engage in a project on thinking about creating a curriculum for mathematics based on the absolute best science for preschoolers, just a year before they enroll in school. My idea was that if the kids who attend the most, the kids, in this case it's in urban slums in Delhi, attend this very small informal school, are coming from poorer families, if they arrive with a leg up, then this little advantage we can give them at the beginning is going to sustain them and grow into an advantage that's bigger and bigger. So that was kind of the idea in the back of my mind. But I learned something else in the process. So what we did is we worked in about 210 Pratham-run preschool classes in Delhi. And we took these classes and grouped them into 3 groups randomly with 3 different treatments. In one group, we introduced a curriculum of math games. I'll show you the games in a minute, or some examples in a minute. These are concrete material math games that rely on a child's intuitive sense of mathematics that every child bearing extreme disability has before they can even count. So before you're exposed to symbols and shapes and stuff like that, you can already know what's bigger, what's smaller, what shapes look like they are the same, what shape looks like they are different. And those skills can be trained. And the idea is that if you train those skills, those intuitive skills, you can, that creates, our hope is that it would create a bedrock under which the formal mathematics could be built. So we created those math games. It's a curriculum of a few weeks. And then we created social games which have exactly the same rules, but they don't train mathematics, they train social skills. The idea was to make sure that any effect of the math games was really due to mathematics and not to playing games. We started with a pre-test, and we played the games, then we had a first post-test and 2 post-tests after that. Let me show you a little bit the games. So this is, for example, numerical comparison. They have, the kids has a red basket and a blue basket, and then they have to sort the cards. So there are more red dots, probably, so you put it in the red basket, and then here there are more blue dots, you put it in a blue basket, and when you turn the card, you can check your answer, and you also get the numbers. So that's speed sorting. Then there is visual form analysis, so which card does not belong with the rest. So a child could say, well, let me try the bottom second one. Well, no, that's not this one, but that's this one. That's the top one. It doesn't belong with the rest because the dot is not on the line, it's a little below. So the social games had exactly the same rules, but instead of relying on mathematics, they relied on being able to recognize emotions, which is a useful skill in and of itself, but should not be expected to have impacts on mathematics. And what we found is that from the very beginning, after playing the games for a few months, in all of the mathematics questions, you can see the blue bar is the size of the difference between the people exposed to the math games and people exposed to no games at all. And you can see that all of the bars are high and vertical. And in comparison, the red bars are the same difference in mathematics, but for people exposed to the social games, and those are much lower. So that really tells you that playing those games did train the kids. Secondly, the effect is persistent. When we look 6 months later, which is the blue bar here, or a full year later, which is the other blue bar here, you can see that these effects are very strong. So after 1 year after having played the games, 18 months after having played the games, the kids are better at doing mathematics, at least this form of non-symbolic mathematics, which should be the basis on which mathematics education is formed. The only problem is that there is absolutely no translation to school mathematics. So as an intervention, that particular intervention didn't work. We are now we've just developed one that seems to be working much better as an intervention. But that's neither here nor there. The point is that it didn't work, despite the fact that the kids are definitely better at math. This is something that the school system wasn't able to pick up. The reason being, probably, that the way that mathematics is taught is too much at this stage in grade 1, like a poem, you recite the multiplication table. The fact that you know how shapes relate to each other, in a sense, is irrelevant. So that's the first example of the first instance of the school system not only not producing knowledge, but also being unable to identify and leverage the knowledge and the skills that are there, which is an even bigger waste, in a sense, than what we have been thinking about and trying to address. Here is another example of that among adolescents, which is what we call the market math study. It was a study done by Abhijit Banerjee and Raghav Chattopadhyay in Kolkata, and a follow-up study that I became involved with in Delhi. What we did in both studies is to send people to buy goods from adolescents who are selling on the markets. So usually picture on adolescent boys. Most of you have done some vegetable shopping probably in the not too distant past. So we only focused on people who were selling at least 2 different things, say aubergine and eggplant, or aubergine and tomatoes. And the interviewer go with saying, I would like 300 grams of aubergine and 400 grams of tomatoes, and then hand the kids 200 rupees to get the change. So what the child needs to do is apply the unitary method to get the right price of tomatoes and aubergine, then add them up, and then do a subtraction. So that's not easy mathematics, that's pretty complicated mathematics. So we did that for three times. 3 different pairs of people went and bought the goods, and then when that was done, the kids were pulled aside and asked if they were agreeing to participate in a small study, and then they were given a test very much like the ASER test that measure mathematics knowledge, as well as a battery of tests that, in a sense, are going from the most concrete, which is your market transactions that you are doing frequently, to the most abstract, which is the type of ASER math, school math type of studies. So who are our kids? They are typically an adolescent boy. What I want you to point out from this slide is that actually many of them are in school. 70% in Kolkata and 60% in Delhi actually are in school. They go either after the market or before the market. And they tend to be in grade 6 or 7. This is the written assessment. I put it on the board to make it clear what the number I'm going to show you in a minute. You start with subtraction. If the kid manages subtraction, you ask the division question. If they cannot, you ask the double-digit recognition. If they cannot, single-digit, and then if they cannot, they are. And in this way, you determine the level. So the kid is either at subtraction level or at division level, which is higher, or at double-digit or single-digit. And what you can find from this, so another thing we did is that we interviewed school children also in Delhi. Similar areas, similar demographic, same type of kids, but in school, found in school, so most of them were not selling in markets. And what you find when you look at this graph is that the school children do much better on the assert test than the market kids. Of the school children, it's actually doing quite well by India-wide standard. 57% of them are at the division level. Only 70% of the market kids are at division level. And a further 19% are at double-digit subtraction, where we have only, if we had addition these two, we are only about 50% of kids who are who do at least subtraction. So the market children do much worse than the school children at formal mathematics. But then what we also did is that we asked the school children, here's one nice little cute school child, who looked very bemused by what's about to happen to him. We asked them to perform some market transactions. So he's selling vegetables, they have prices. He's selling some items also, because some of the market kids sell items, like unit items, like cigarettes or glasses or stuff like that. And when you do that, you find, I think what's the most striking result in these studies. This is the 3 market transactions for market children, school children, and market adults. So they are simulated market transactions. These are real ones, and these are real ones. And you can see that starting at the second transaction, I can get into why it's at the second transaction they do better. 94 to 95% of the market children get it right. Among the school children, 60 to 50% of them get right the market transaction. The market adults are a bit worse than the market kids. So this is a situation where the school children do much better at ASER and do much more worse at the market math. In addition, this is really overestimating how well the school children do, because when we focus on things that are not units but have quantities and therefore require to apply the unitary method, the score, the level are dreadful. They are absolutely unable to figure out 300 grams of aubergine. In addition, they take a very long time. So the way we did this test, we didn't give them a time limit. So the market kids, of course, do this in seconds. The school children kids do this in about 5 minutes on average. The reason why they take 5 minutes is that they take a piece of paper, and that's the way they calculate, say, 25 times however it was. They just kind of add it up. 13, they add it up. So and then he tries to do some calculation and clearly struggles a bit through the calculation. So they try to apply their school knowledge to a concrete situation, and it's really not up to the mark. So what are we learning here? Is that we have a school system that is unable to, somehow, the way that the ASER test is done with Reflect, school math, is unable to capture the fact that these children in the markets clearly can do mathematics, can do complicated arithmetics. In fact, as complicated at least the double-digit subtraction, but in fact also the division level. So that's the first thing. And the second thing that we are getting is that the school children are learning something, but it's not something that is of, in a sense, any practical use. So we have a system that is failing, in a sense, on both ends. And what is happening to the market kids, which remember many of them are in school, 60 to 70% are also in school, but they don't like school, they feel they are in a failure situation at school, and the first thing that they tell you when you give them a sort of school-type mathematics is, I'm not good at math. Otherwise I wouldn't be here. And then they try and apply, they don't freeze, but they try and apply the algorithm that they have been taught in school, except they don't quite remember them. So you will see a kid, for example, doing the division the wrong way, starting from the left instead of starting from the right, etc. They get kind of confused in their algorithm, and that creates the error, despite the fact that they do these problems in their head constantly. So that's kind of, I wanted to add these two on the sort of traditional assay numbers that you may have seen, to see that this is, in a sense, maybe deeper and more problematic than just the achievement level are no good. The achievement level are no good, but even to the extent they are not that bad, they actually do not impart useful knowledge that the kids can actually take and do something with in their life. And they are missing knowledge that is out there in the field and somehow is like petrified out of the children before we get a chance to do something about. So that's the problem. So that's the diagnosis of the problem. Now, what is the source of the problem? So let me start by trying to take out 3 ideas of your mind. I'm not going to succeed, but at least I would have made an attempt. The first one is that it is not because children are undernourished. It is not because they are first-generation learners and they don't get help. It is not because any sort of reason somehow will prevent these children to learn. These children are perfectly able to learn, at least from the get-go. Second thing I want to try and get out is that it is not because because teachers are poorly paid. And more generally, it is not really about resources. Third thing is that it is not mainly about incentives, in the sense that teachers are not bad people. They're trying to understand what their job is supposed to be, and they're trying to do it. It's just that, so it's not about people, the teachers just not performing what they understand their mission to be. So let me spend a few minutes on each of these aspects. That's what I'm going to do in the next few minutes. Why do I think it's not anything to do with like nutrition or low level of support at home or whatnot? It's because of my little preschoolers. So when we look at the preschoolers, the type of games that they were exposed to are the non-symbolic games like the speed sorting and there is actually any number. I just show you 2 examples, but there is a whole array of them. They were developed after piloting, based on the cognitive science that exists, was mainly developed in labs in the US, and after extensive piloting in labs in the US with Cambridge, Mass children who, as we know, are like superbly intelligent. And what you find, actually, not just in Cambridge, Mass, but across any number of these studies where these kids have been looked at, mainly in the US, to some extent in Europe, a number of correlations that you observe between, for example, the ability of kids to do non-symbolic numeric mathematics, like comparison of dots and non-symbolic additions, etc., and then their numeric abilities, like symbolic additions. These two are very correlated across children, even over time. On the other hand, for example, there is less correlation between my ability to orient myself in a map and my ability to do operations. So there's kind of a number of things like that people have found, and we can replicate all of them among our little Indian kids in Delhi. They're doing just as well with the math games, with the tests that relate to the skills in those math games. They have the same type of correlations. They just, at the age of 4 or 5, they are behaved just like any kid from an affluent family in the US. So, at least from the get-go, and at least in Delhi, I'm not saying that it's not different in a very rural area where people are not eating enough, but that's not the issue, right? And it's in Delhi that we see the mathematicians being lost. The second thing is that it's not teacher salaries, it's not other resources. So first of all, teachers are highly paid in India relative to anybody else with a similar level of education and skills. Teacher salaries are much higher in government schools than in the cheap private schools that kids attend to when they are in rural areas. And yet the performance in private school is at least as good as the performance in public school. More on that later. I'm going to make this statement much more precise later. But it's not worse. So you have a private school teacher who is paid about a fourth of a public school teacher, and they are doing, let's say, just as well. Likewise, non-permanent teachers who are paid a fraction of a regular teacher's salaries tend to be more effective. There are studies on that. Finally, there are two studies, one in Indonesia, one in Kenya, where there was actually experiments done with doubling teacher salary, and that produced obviously almost a doubling in the education budget, since most of the budget is made of teacher salaries, and precisely zero impact on learning. So this is not teacher salaries. More generally, it's not resources as just more resources to do the same thing. It's not about toilets for girls. It's not even about cutting class size, because any expense of cutting class size without doing other things has also been largely disappointing. So it's certainly not teacher resources, and more generally not teachers' salary, and more generally not resources. Teacher incentive is a little bit more of a delicate point, because if you can give very targeted incentive to one thing in particular, then you get some effect of that. So for example, I did a study in Udaipur, not among government school teachers, but among non-formal education teachers, where absenteeism rates were super high, higher than it is in government schools. And we gave them small incentive to actually come to school, and there you find that if you give them an incentive, they do come more often, and the kids do better. So more days of school translate into more learning. Kartik Muralidharan and Venki Sundararaman in Andhra Pradesh have a study where they give incentive based on test scores, and they do find an increase on test scores. There's one issue there, which is there is some amount of teaching to the test, that shows that you can direct the effort towards a particular goal, but it might be a little bit short term. However, what I really want to insist on is that it's incentive for what? In a sense, the places where you should have the biggest incentive are in private school, because in private school, teachers need to please the parents. So we should find that if incentives were really what matters, we should find private school to do much, much better than public school. And in fact, if you look just at simple correlation, you find that on average, say the assert test scores of kids who attend private school is better than the assert test score of kids who attend public school. So that led many people to say these type of correlations, which you find everywhere, had led many people to conclude that yes, private schools are better, and so it's all about teachers being lazy, etc. But of course, that forgets one fundamental problem, which is kids who go to private schools are highly selected. Their parents have decided that they should go to private school, so their parents are interested. Even within a family will identify the kid that they think is the brightest and put all of their educational eggs in the basket of that particular child, and that child will go to private school. So of course, when you look at the kids who are in private school, they are the kids who have more facilities with schoolwork to start with. So there is another experiment by Kartik Muralidharan, and this sent to people, where they set out to prove that private schools were in fact more effective than public schools, and for that they gave the kids vouchers. In Andhra Pradesh, they gave the kids vouchers to attend a private school. And many of the kids who got a voucher went to private school, and many of the kids who did not get the vouchers did not go to private school. So what you can do now is to compare the kids who won the voucher with the kids who didn't win the voucher. And what you find is that for maths and Telugu, actually the bar are going the wrong way. You're reading them right. The kid who won the voucher do worse in math this is year 2 and this is year 4, they do worse in math and they do worse in Telugu than the kids who went to the public school. To be fair, these numbers are not significant, so you can think of them as being zeros. But they're certainly not a sign of huge increase. And then you have English, where a lot of these schools are English medium, which doesn't mean that English is great, but you do see progress in English. So on average, you get a big fat 0, which is really a combination of the private schools doing better in English and worse at everything else. So that says that the private schools do respond to parents' demand, which is they want their kids to be educated in English, but that doesn't translate into better learning gains, since we see no impact on the subjects that are taught equally, in a sense, in the two sets of schools. So I think that's telling us something about, it's not merely about the incentive, the lack of effort and something like that. It's more about the effort being misguided or going in the wrong direction. So if that's not, the kids can't learn, if it's not the teacher salary and other resources, if it's not incentives, what is it? With Abhijit Banerjee, we've been we've been calling as the tyranny of the curriculum. The tyranny of the curriculum is something actually not a unique Indian affliction, but is certainly one that is very strong in India, which is no matter what children can do, you cannot afford not to complete the curriculum. And here the teachers have very strong incentives to do that. In fact, the right to education made things worse because it enshrined it into law that they cannot not complete the curriculum. And when you see the curriculum, it's a bit mind-boggling. So I just took a small snapshot of one curriculum. This is for grade 4. We are now in monthly, so in October, they need to understanding the circles, the radius of the circles, drawing a circle using compass, maybe that would be fine. Except it's not clear where the compasses may come from. Then, by November, they need to understand patterns. Oh, I forgot that they should understand fraction by the middle of grade 4. Then they need to understand patterns. Then they need to know their multiplication table up to 15. I've never learned them past 10. They need to understand kilograms, convert units, etc. And then in January, they need to know perimeters of regular and irregular figure. They need to be able to solve for an area of regular and irregular figure, etc. So the curriculum is very, very, very prescribing and incredibly ambitious. I just wanted to have it once because suddenly I thought maybe I'm all making this up about this curriculum, but it's clearly not the case. And it's not a specially selected thing. So as I said, it's not only an Indian problem, it's related to how elitist the curriculum is. We have the same problem in Kenya. We actually have the same, it's not just a poor country problem. We have the same problem in France, where we have a uniform curriculum which is very elitist and which has where the project is to select as we go, with, in a sense, the same result, with excellent top of the distribution and huge waste at the bottom. And then, on the other hand, you have, of course, the well-known opposite situation in Finland, where kids don't even start to learn to read until they are 7 and go very slowly, etc., which has great test scores. That's not a proof. This is just to place that into perspective. So, given that, what can we do? I'll go back to the idea that seems simple enough to maybe we should try and fix the curriculum, but that doesn't seem to be available just right now. So in the meantime, the answer that Pradham has developed over the year is the idea of teaching at the right level. We took them a long time. The attribution of this term is Rukmini Banerjee, but they took a long time to agree to call it by its official name, teaching at the right level. But the fundamental idea has been around for a very long time. So the idea is that while you have this, the way that you can improve the learning in schools is you can address the teaching to the children who really are here. So it's not remedial education, because some kids don't need remediation. Some kids are doing very well, thank you very much. So these children will be exposed to what they need to learn, and there is material developed to them, but you rearrange your population in front of you, not by their age, but by what they know as of today. And of course, the goal is to move them from group to group. The teachers or volunteers are assigned to the group, and then they are taught according to the current learning level. And then there is an ongoing monitoring and assessment which allows the kids to go up and down. That seems, given this, what we have said until now, that there is knowledge around, but we are not able to capture it. And part of it is due to the fact that the curriculum addresses some child who actually is not present in the classroom. That seems eminently sensible. But how do we know that it works? So there I want to step back just for a minute, and sort of as a way of, giving you a tiny intellectual history of the way that our work works, is the Pratham and JPAL collaboration. So how do we know that whether or not the approach actually works? So what JPAL does is running what's called randomized control trials. That's an example, actually, from another type of program of actual villages which were randomized into groups. The reason why I like these maps is you can see that we have two types of program, the blue program of the red program. You don't need to know what it is in particular. And then the remaining villages are the comparison. And you can see that they are nicely spread around. This is a satellite photo of Udaipur district, just in case you want to know where that is. So they are all spread around because since they were randomly selected, there is nothing different about one group and another. And what the great value of that is that because you've randomly selected which type of villagers get what, there is no reason to expect any difference between different groups, except for some got some treatment and some got some other. So go back, for example, to the private school example. And in the private school example, you have that thing that the kids who are in private school are different because they are not randomly selected. So what does JPAL do? We do randomized control trials, and we work with partners to work on randomized control trials, and we try and diffuse the evidence of randomized control trials. I think one of the things that I want to emphasize, because that's going to be very relevant in our collaboration with Pratham, is that we are not a consulting firm. First of all, we stick around for a very long time. Our relationship with Pratham started about 20 years ago. You cannot get rid of us usually when you start working with us. And on the other hand, we don't charge money. So we just need money to do survey, but not for our time. What we call the RCT revolution has been, in a sense, more about this partnership, this development of evaluation methods and innovations in the social space together than about just evaluating like this, your program works, it doesn't. And I think I'm going to try and make that clear. This is just a map of where we're working. So it's not just India, but you can see that there's a big blob of points in India. JPAL South Asia is one of our bigger offices. We today have 160 staff working across policy, research, and training. And Pratham was our oldest partner, so much so that Pratham was partnering with JPAL before JPAL existed. At the time, it was just like us. And over the years, we've been constantly working. So what I'm talking about today is really not the result of I am evaluating this. It has worked. This is the next step I took. Is this kind of long back and forth and then introducing government, so you will see in a minute. So now, what are the key results? So the first thing we did is took, in a sense, the TRL model as implemented in as well as possible, although it evolved over the years, to show that it works. Like if it's well done, it's implemented by volunteers or by local tutors, it produces very large learning gains. And more or less, it seems to be context independent. We did it in various states and various rural, urban, etc. Doesn't seem to be any problem to replicate from context to context. However, what we also learn in this process is that it's nice, but when you do this out of school, too few of the eligible children do attend. So you get very large effect on the kids who attend, multiplied by not enough of the kids do attend, which gives us a final result that is too small. So after these results, there was really a need that was felt by Pratham that you need to develop a model that can be implemented through the government school system. So because that's where the kids are. If you want a large number of kids, that's where you're going to find them. So it led up to kind of the process of how do you scale up TRL. And this is what I've come to refer to as a plumbing problem. A plumbing problem is, in a sense, you want to do something. So the first problem, of course, is to convincing the elite. Suppose we succeed. In some cases, we've succeeded. But the problem number 2 is once the elite has decided, say the principal secretary education is really enthusiastic, maybe even the people below, how do you get the program to take with the teachers? Like, it's not enough to train them and deliver the material and hope that it's gonna work. And that is what we are now doing a lot of work with in JPAL generally, is this plumbing problem, which is once a government has decided to do something, there is a very long way to go between that intention and what happens in the field. And this very long way to go is not a fatality. It's not something that you can say, oh, there is just a leaky bucket with a lot of holes. That transmission depends on exactly how the program was structured and how it fits in the overall incentive architecture that is set up in the organization, whether your program is managing to fit in and somehow ride the train, or whether it stays in the station and the train goes without you. I don't know if the analogy, I'm getting mixed up with my analogy. The reason why it's a kind of a plumbing problem, I call it a plumbing problem in the Eli lecture that I gave was The Economist as Plumber, is to say that economists tend to be scientists. They think about abstract problems and they want to solve the problems nicely. Then maybe they become engineer, which is to say, well, if I cannot fully, in theory, solve the problem, I'm going to at least simulate it with my computer. And what I want them to do is to go one more step, and that's what we are trying to do, is to become plumber and say, well, why don't you put it in the field and see what happens? What you're going to realize is that many of the things of the problems that you are going to encounter, you didn't even think of. You're not going to be able to think of them in the abstract until you've actually tried it out at scale. So that's kind of my plumbing sideline. So what did we do? So first thing we did, and Rukmini was just reminding me that's quite kind of a very important program, is that we worked with government school teachers in summer camps. Same teacher, summer break, 1 month, we rehired them. And then we did a randomized control trials of doing basically the Pratham model over the summer. And it worked very nicely with a good increase in Hindi. This was just for Hindi. Again, despite the fact that not enough kids came. So again, we have the same problem of it works very well if kids come, but then not enough kids come. But what this tells us is that the teachers are perfectly able to implement this curriculum. So that's a good thing to do. They can do it. In the summer, they don't have other things to do, they can do it. So now we worked in 2 states, in Bihar and in Uttarakhand. And we tried first a replication of the volunteer model, and then one where we trained the teacher and gave them, or Pratham trained the teacher and gave them the material. Uttarakhand was similar, and then there was also a volunteer in school. Here are the results sort of at a glance. So at least in this case, all of the bars are in the right direction. But what you can see is that, so the replication of the kind of traditional Pratham model works very nicely. The teacher, this is a summer camp, that's not bad. It's almost as good. So it's again, replication of the teacher model. And then the summer teachers, almost as good. But of course, that's a disappointing thing, is that anything else was kind of a failure, disappointing. At least it doesn't get to that outcome. So what happened? What happened is that the teachers seem to have been unable or unwilling to implement the program in the schools. We sent teams to look at what is happening actually in the schools. And what they showed us is that although the teachers were in fact trained and the material were in fact distributed, the material was often used, but there was almost never any grouping by level, which is kind of the fundamental idea of the Pratham program approach. So somehow it didn't happen. And why? So then the question is, why it doesn't happen in the year when it happened in the school year? Like, what is it that we missed? And we identified 2 things that were really missing. One is that the teachers tell us, you're very nice, I really like your training, you're nice people, but I still have my curriculum to complete. I cannot waste time and share, do these nice activities when, I am supposed to do the area of the perimeter or what have you. So there was really two things to do there. One is so what was striking in this reflex is that in principle, the instruction is coming from the hierarchy, right? Because the government was party of this program, but they just didn't buy it. And you will see it's not the only time that they didn't buy what was coming from the hierarchy. The second thing is that, so the first thing that we thought was important then is to make sure that that message was relayed by their immediate supervisor, which are these cluster-led coordinators. And the second thing is to force the creation of a space. So you have to create a space where they are freed mentally from that curriculum idea. So one possibility is to do it in short bursts during the school year, where you sort of have a whole all-out model for a few weeks. In fact, the teachers can go and volunteers can do it. Or one possibility is to try an hour a day, which is devoted to this. So we tried these two models, once in Haryana. Government teachers were supported by cluster monitors. It was done in school, 1 hour a day, just for Hindi. And that worked very nicely. We had a large effect of that. You can also do the Pratham staff volunteer in the school, because remember the key is we want to be in the school because that's where the kids are. But it really doesn't have to be the teacher if they don't want to be part of it. So in Uttar Pradesh, it was an intensive camp model during about 50 days in the school year for 2 hours a day during school hours, done by volunteers. And that has absolutely phenomenal impacts. So these two models, why was it important to develop them? Because these are models that can be and have been taken to scale. So these are the most recent numbers. The partnership model is in 13 states, 28,000 schools, 4 million kids. This is not all the kids in India, so still has to be a lot of progress there, but that's quite a few children, more than in the whole country of Sweden, probably. The direct learning camp model is a smaller model. It's more resource intensive, but it's still in 4,000 schools and 200,000 kids. And then there is also scaling up of that approach outside India. These are the countries that I know of: Ghana, Zambia, Botswana, and more. So let me conclude by giving you, since I promised that I would be fixing primary education, telling you about how one go about skilling. Given this journey, and in a sense, I hope I reflected, I hope I had adequately conveyed that the process from evaluating the first project, Pratham project, to workable model is about 15 years of a lot of trials and errors. But then at the end, we still have a model we can work with, so that's kind of nice. What do I think about how one will go about fixing primary education? So one first approach that people have been advocating a little bit is giving up on schools. And it's not crazy. There are digital efforts that you can now, tablets are very cheap. You can distribute a ton of them. You can just say, okay, fine, we are just going to work outside of the school system. That way we don't have to deal with the curriculum, and we don't have to deal with we can just innovate on the content, etc. And you either you give up on the school system. So it has great potential, and some evaluations have been done of some digital platforms. For example, MindSpark has had a randomized control trial, and the effects are just phenomenal on the people who participate. So it's quite satisfying. It works very well. But I want to say that a fundamental problem with this approach is that kids are in school. They are there. They are a captive audience. Anything else requires them to show up. And that is something that we really struggled with in the evaluation of Freed India, which was working very well, but the kids weren't coming. And in the evaluation of MindSpark that I just mentioned, after the end of the evaluation, the parents basically drove them out. They did think that MindSpark they were not interested in paying even like a penny for continuing the program. So So the problem is that there are two issues. One is that the schools continue to have the monopoly of what constitutes knowledge and the monopoly of certification. So you cannot not deal with them. And the second is parents continue to buy into the obsession of elitism, which we saw in the private school. And therefore, school is valuable in their mind for the possibilities it opens up more than for the learning. And as long as you have that, I think you have to find a way of dealing with the schools. Doesn't mean you cannot do all of this stuff, but it won't be the entire solution. How about changing the curriculum and making it more realistic? That, of course, would be lovely. I think that remains the holy grail. I'm not going to hold my breath till that happens. In a sense, there is a tremendous opposition in the education world from doing that. This is watering down, etc. We seem to be going the other way with the RCT, and partial efforts are counterproductive. So we evaluated the sort of I guess it's the day before yesterday, latest initiative, the continuous comprehensive evaluation. If anything, which is basically replacing the exams by frequent evaluation by teachers. If anything, the effect of that are negative. So partly because it's one more thing to do for the teachers without freeing them of the actual curriculum, so they cannot use the information they're gathering to change their activities because they don't have the time. Another thing that I've been kind of starting to do is to work on the margin. Some part of the systems are more open. Preschool, of course, is lovely, no one cares yet. Even early grades, grade 1 and 2, there is some margin. Summers, beautiful. Tutoring, a nice way of kind of, doing things. A lot of kids attend coaching classes, and you can maybe have more flexibilities there. And then schools that are completely ineffective, where you can actually come and teach the kids. But the fear is that these open margins, you cannot count on them for too long. Yesterday, I was reading an email from Center Square Foundation, which provides its regular updates on the education world. And the top 2 item was, Supreme Court want to regulate coaching centers. There goes my tutoring as a way of, as a margin. And then a new report calls for folding 4 to 6 years education as part of right to education. There goes my preschool hope. So you cannot count on them. For the moment, it's available, but might not be safe. So what is left? That's going to be a little bit of, a little bit of disappointment, maybe. I think what is left is patience. I know that it's not something that, especially in Bangalore, people like. They want to go fast and they want to, revolution things now. But ultimately, there is not going to be a silver bullet. We will need to continue to engage with the school system as it is, however slow and fits and start it's gonna be, not as your only strategy, but as part of your strategy. The good thing is that we know what needs to be done. There are various ways to get there. I'm not saying that the Pratham TRL strategy per se is the only way that we can get there, but we know exactly what needs to be done, which is to bring the level of instruction at the level where the kids are. The challenge, I think, to do it is to exploit the wedges that are there today, remain open to any other one that comes in, including individuals, including new places and they are real gains. They might not be stratospheric gains right away, but any of these real gains get multiplied by millions of children, so they immediately become something to be counted on. Thank you very much.
Wonderful lecture. There's a profile of Professor Esther Duflo in the New Yorker, which you can read. It's available online. And there's a wonderful line in that by the person who tracked her and followed her for many months before he wrote that profile. And he said, her aim is to do good science and do good. I'd like to invite our founding trustee, Nandan Nilekani, who will take the evening forward. Nandan? Esther, thank you, Esther. Thank you.
First of all, Esther, thank you very much for a brilliant presentation and really putting us through the whole issues of primary education. But, the sense I get
is that, even when you do very rigorous
randomized control
trials and demonstrate that some policies
work better than others, the system doesn't necessarily take it forward. Is this something which is common in your work, that you guys do all this stuff and you prove something and then what happens next?
I think it eventually does. So, for example, that's where I put these slides about where the TRL partnerships are now, which is, still 13 states and 5 million kids, so it's not nothing. It takes some time. And that, I think, is not Indian specialty, in the sense that there is a reason for the taking some time. Is that plumbing question I was talking about, which is it's not sufficient to get buy-in. It's also from the top. It's also necessary to get an idea of how you're going to structure it such that it becomes part and parcel of what all of the agents are doing and that they know that they are supposed to do, etc. Now, in education, we have the extra problem is that looming over all of this is that question of the curriculum, which at the end of the day creates some amount of, is somewhat hemming in what can be done until this is fixed. But we cannot just wait for the revolution to come. Something has to be done in the meantime. So that means you have to be more creative for how will you find some little spaces to do things anyway. So it's not sufficient to say the way that things work, and that is not just India, it's everywhere. It's not. I've done good science, I've demonstrated something works, and therefore it's going to be adopted everywhere. The way that things work is that you try something out somewhere, and then some version of it could be adopted in a larger scale, but that's going to be a slightly different version necessarily because the scale is larger, and so you necessarily advance in this slightly progressive way. The good thing is that we see, I think, over time, more willingness to, try things out and experiment at the margin of what's already there.
But do you think time is running out? Because, Asar has been studying now for 10 years, Rukmini? And there doesn't seem to be much improvement. And in the meantime, we have peak child, and if you don't get this right in the next few years, it's going to be a long-term big problem.
I'm not sure I buy that time is running out. It is, clearly we have to be focused on these issues, and we have to do as well as possible and as quickly as possible. But to say, when you said time is running out, what have you said? One still need to do something, so.
No, I'm saying, okay, maybe this is a Bangalore problem of impatience on problem solving. But, if this takes another 10 years to fix, then by the time another 200 million kids have gone to the system without learning. And that's what I meant by time is running out.
Yeah, on the other hand, if you don't do anything now, and it's going to take another 20 years to fix, then it's 400 million kids who are.
No, I'm not saying don't do it. I'm just saying that the pace, how do we increase the pace of this stuff?
So I think these things tend to be snowballing. So in other settings, I think I think it's more likely once you find something that can take and that you can show that can be scaled up and doesn't break any classes, and everybody emerges alive from the system, then you can have a larger expansion of that system. So the hope is that from the 5 million children there is today, you're not going to have a linear progression of, I'm not saying necessarily that particular model, but any model that seeks to address specifically the same question, which is children who are in school, focusing on what they know and getting them there through any number of methods that people can patent to their own name. That doesn't so much matter. I think that's going to be now that there are at least 2 versions of it that have shown that they can be implemented and they can take. The hope is that that's going to be much more than proportional.
No, but I think the message we got from you is that ultimately, unless the formal education system embraces this, you won't get the scale that you want. And the formal education system is in the tyranny of the curriculum. And the curriculum is designed by a bunch of guys sitting in some conference room in Delhi, applying some theoretical kind of idealism. So unless you crack that problem and get those guys to realize the ground reality is different, you will never get that everywhere. So how do you plan to change the minds of those chaps in Delhi who sit in conference rooms and plan this stuff?
I think that's more your job than mine.
Okay, I got it. I'll do it. No, okay, fine. I think I will do this. Okay, we'll just switch. We'll just switch gears. I think you did this very famous talk on The Economist as plumber, right? And it got a lot of reaction. And all the economists that I know are macroeconomists who pontificate about GDP and economic growth and fiscal deficit and balance of payments and all that, and they sit and give lectures. So how do they view? So they think of themselves as some kind of visionaries or something. So how do they view it when you say that it's about plumbing? I mean, do they get offended?
Well, you know me, so there are a few. I don't think so. I think that I'm not saying that every single economist should be a plumber. What I'm arguing is that some of us should do some plumbing some of the time, which is less. Leaves a bunch of space to the real scientists and philosophers among us to continue their thoughtful pursuits. So I think it is pretty clear that the field. I don't want you to think that I'm running this crusade and against the elements and there is after all. I'm completely, as an economist, I'm in the mainstream. I have lots of students, etc., who are doing this job, who are doing this type of work. There are now hundreds of people who do this work. In fact, one of the things that this emphasis on working on details and designing programs and then evaluating them, etc., is that it has given a tool for people who were interested in doing things that were applied to do it in a more disciplined, rigorous way, which I think has made it more attractive. So it has created a whole, subfield, and we do that. And in fact, the macroeconomists have their own crisis, and they are fighting between each other, and they are so busy fighting with each other that they have no interest in us, and we just continue.
No, I think I must say that what you have created is astonishing because JPAL is truly an empire of the mind. It's an empire. You run an empire. The whole RCT empire. No, not small, it's very big. And the fact that you have this, when I look at the influence that you're having and the fact that you have hundreds of PhDs and post-PhDs working around the world, hundreds of academics, all the big foundations and the bilaterals supporting it. It's really, I think, I have not seen anything in the economics or social science space where somebody has created such a gigantic empire around one idea. So I think it's remarkable what you have done, and I'm sure that more and more people will recognize that. So how did you create this empire of the mind?
So the way it was working is that it's not an empire, it's more like a city. It's a network. So basically we started, so when we started, it was only 8 of us who started JPAL, and we kind of one day basically hung out our shingles and called ourselves Poverty Action Lab. The J came a little later. And we basically wanted some support around what we were doing. But from the beginning, the one thing that we did differently is that we decided that we were a network. And that we are, basically JPAL is at the service of its network and not at the service of me or my research, etc. It's based at MIT, but the network is based worldwide. And of course, then in turn, this network is relying on a network of NGOs, of government partners, of companies, etc. And any things that, so any improvements over the years, of course, we became better at thinking about how you conduct this kind of works, at collecting data, at talking to partners, etc. And all of this knowledge gets immediately reverberated in the network. And all of the knowledge, so there is knowledge on methods and there is knowledge of course content knowledge, like ideas that are being generated, which again kind of reverberates on the network. So the network lives its life, it's completely organic, it's not very directed. For example, each each team has a set of scientific directors who completely live their life and they don't report to anybody, and it's kind of in this way that it has expanded. So it's more like an octopus than an empire.
Octopus. Octopus of the mind. But I think, I'm not sufficiently clued in, but I don't think there's anything else like this. I don't think in any other field of academic research or social science, even in hard sciences, I don't think that anyone who has done this model. So it's really unique. I don't think anybody else has this model of this network collaboration, loose, octopus, whatever. Is there anybody else who has anything close to? I don't think so, right?
At least we didn't copy it on someone else, but it seemed to us to be the natural way that one should do the thing. Like, because we are not particularly interested in doing it to support our work, we were interested in doing it. The day we created JPAL is that we didn't want just to create our research project, but we wanted the tool to get better and to get more widely applied and to get more useful and to spread. So in this sense, the network is like the completely natural way to go.
Yeah, but I think the reason why I call it an empire of the mind is that it's not about controlling and directing, but it's about your idea becoming hugely influential, which is what you have done. So I think that's really the remarkable thing. So congratulations, and maybe we'll throw it open for questions from the audience. If anybody has any questions, you can stand up. Karan. Is that Karan, right? Yeah. Karan, why don't you ask your question?
Hi, good evening. I know you talked really briefly about tuitions, but I wanted to bring your attention back to that and ask you to go into a little more detail. When you look at states like West Bengal, tuition rates are 70% of school-age kids are seeing tutors, and I believe across urban and rural it's around 20-25%. So just have you looked at that? What are your kind of thoughts? I know you said that you're worried that that window is closing, but how have you guys explored that, and what kind of possibilities do you see there?
So I've never done anything about tuition, although I've always thought that one should do something about tuition, but I have never personally done any project involving tuition. But I very briefly mentioned the MindSpark evaluation, which is a project by Kartik Muralidharan. What they exploited is tuition. Basically, kids going to a tuition center, and they basically introduced the MindSpark program as in some of the tuition center. And that was possible because there was some flexibility there. They find this huge effect, but then parents still thought it was kind of a waste of time, which is somehow remarkable. That's one example, and I think one could, although this is a bit disappointing, the end of the story in this case, I think one could kind of go back to that model and start to think, like, what can we do with the tuition? With a combination of, I think one has to go back to the pedagogy, but for example, the market math studies or even the preschool studies made me think that there are things that can be done to take the kids and bring them quickly to a level where not only they would have learned something, but even the school would have recognized they would have learned something. And if you're able to do that, whichever way, then the parents would be willing to at least let their kids attend those tuitions, so because that will translate into better test scores and not just better learning, which is what we are looking for, but isn't sufficient at some point.
Thanks, Karan. You had a question?
Yeah. Thank you, ma'am, for this brilliant, good presentation. You have covered the ground realities. So even I too have worked on that, my personal passion was there, so I covered that thing. So the two things I have observed, what the problem where exists, you have covered, gross enrollment ratio is very high, but the attendance is very low. On the another side, when you see the teacher-student ratio is very low, and one teacher is covering
Is it a question or comment?
Yeah, it's a question. So, have you covered that thing in your research, teacher-student ratio? And another thing the primary school teachers do is doing a supplementary job, covering the survey and doing the other things. So, are you including those things in analyzing the quality of that research, basically?
Yeah, so on the pupil-teacher ratio, I briefly mentioned that. Whenever it's been tested, that's not the problem. You can cut a class in two, but if on its own, it makes no difference. So that's not sufficient. I guess I could have put a line, it's not the census. Like, you know, it could be better if teachers were not doing the census, but the census is not responsible for the low learning level of Indian kids.
Okay, so first, just really thank you for a fantastic speech and also just being able to explain a very complex topic to, you know, many of us here are very lay people, so explaining it so simply. Thank you for that. I had a clarification question about the approach that you're recommending. It sounds like you're recommending this approach at a primary school level. So my question is, you know, as people grow out of primary school and, you know, as they get to, let's say, towards college level, do you continue this process of, you know, dealing with multiple age groups and, you know, depending on, or is this at some point where they have to catch up? And in that case, do they catch up to a curriculum? You know, because, I mean, traditionally, especially in India, we are very curriculum conscious, maybe worldwide as well, but somehow, you know, I'm not comfortable with I can imagine doing it at a primary level, but if you keep doing it, at some point, there has to be a catch-up point where, you know, you can't have a 16-year-old and a 12-year-old in the same classroom, or, you know, so I was wondering what happens at later stages and, you know, where does it move from there? What's your recommendation?
So I think maybe Rukmini would be better placed to answer this question than me, but I think you identified the right problem, which is you need to go, first the kids need to learn to read and then they need to read to learn. And at least at a conceptual level, that nut has been cracked on how you can learn to read. But at the, you know, then how do you read to learn? This is, I think, where the effort of, you know, digital content and change, this is kind of the next big challenge, not only at an implementation level, which is level where we are at the primary level, but also at the conceptual level. Is that fair? Or?
So Louis Mumford, he was a 20th century urban theorist. He once said that great cities offer the widest facilities for conversation, and dialogue is one of the ultimate expressions of life in the city. And we've thought of that at New India Foundation. We're based in Bangalore, and I think you'll agree that today was sort of great dialogue. Obviously, great cities have great citizens, so thank you all for coming. Great cities obviously have great newspapers. Thank you, Times of India. And thank you, Esther. You have a sick child at home, and we really appreciate you being here. And obviously, inshallah, when you and Abhijit get the big prize, many of us in Bangalore will know why. Thank you very much.